Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and a very good afternoon. Yang amat berhormat Tan Sri Datuk Haji Muhyiddin Haji Muhammad Yassin, Prime Minister of Malaysia. Yang mulia Tengku Datuk Dr. Muhammad Azman Sharifuddin Tengku Ibrahim, the Chairman, Board of Directors, Universiti Malaya. Yang berbahagia Profesor Datuk Insinyur Dr. Muhammad Hamdi Abdul Syukur, the Vice Chancellor, Universiti Malaya. Yang berusaha Profesor Dr. Edmund Terence Gomez, Dean, Faculty of Economics and Administration, our honourable speakers, yang berbahagia Tan Sri Dr. Zeti Aziz, yang berusaha Dr. Syed Hussein Ali, yang berusaha Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram, and yang berusaha Mrs. Khoo Siew Man, Board of Directors of Universiti Malaya, the Management of Universiti Malaya, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, selamat datang and welcome to a tribute to Royal Professor Ungku Abdul Aziz 1922-2020. The late Royal Professor Ungku Abdul Aziz Ungku Abdul Hamid is very well known for his outstanding contribution to the field of education and economy in Malaysia. This program is an initiative by the Faculty of Economics and Administration and the Ungku Aziz Center for Development Studies, Universiti Malaya, to commemorate the contributions of the late Royal Professor Ungku Abdul Aziz to the nation. We have gathered prominent speakers who will pay special tributes to Royal Professor Ungku Abdul Aziz for his contributions in various fields. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, before we begin our program, I would like to call Mr. Muhammad Shazril Nazwan Muhammad Yassin to recite the dua.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and very good afternoon. Let us begin our program today with Ummul Kitab Al-Fatihah. A'udhu billahi minasyaitanir rajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. Maliki yaumiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdinas siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladzina an'amta 'alaihim ghairil maghdubi 'alaihim waladdallin. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Hamdan yuwafi ni'amahu wa yukafi'u mazidah. Ya Rabbana lakal hamdu kama yanbaghi li jalali wajhikal karim wa 'azimi sultanik. Allahumma salli wa sallim ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim. Allahumma ij'al jam'ana hadha jam'an marhuma wa tafarruqana min ba'dihi tafarruqan ma'suma. Rabbana atina fid dunya hasanah wa fil akhirati hasanah wa qina adzaban nar. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.
Thank you, Mr. Shazril. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite Professor Dr. Edmund Terence Gomez, Dean, Faculty of Economics and Administration, Universiti Malaya, to deliver his welcoming speech. Please welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Diana, for making the introductions for our guests today. And welcome to this tribute to Royal Professor Ungku Abdul Aziz. When we planned this tribute, we wanted it to be a personal reflection of Pa Ungku's life, by those who knew him well, and by those who understood what drove him as a scholar, an institution builder, and as a teacher who wanted to mold the minds of young people who came to this university to receive sound tutelage. We invited speakers who could draw attention to why Pa Ungku took his role as a public intellectual so seriously, as an academic who strove to use his research findings to inform policies and to bring about real change in society. Pa Ungku's research focus was on the most marginalized of people, the rural poor. What was it about his personal experiences and his education that he received that made him so committed to helping the poor, to working with rural communities, and devoting his scholarly life and his time in retirement to helping them? Pak Ungku made an option for the poor. And in making this decision to deal with eradicating poverty, he knew that he had to create core institutions. And one institution that Pak Ungku built to provide insights into the methods to deal with the scourge of widespread poverty was the Faculty of Economics and Administration. The Economics Department was once part of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, when the Faculty of Economics and Administration, now popularly known as FEA, when it was formed, he created a faculty that did not focus solely on economics. Indeed, FEA remains today a faculty that is quite multidisciplinary in its structure. In FEA, apart from the departments of Applied and Analytical Economics, he created the departments of Public Administration, Business, Accounting, Statistics, and Rural Development. When FEA was created, there was even a discussion about whether the faculty should include the Department of Sociology, as well as other key social science disciplines. Few people in today, or even in FEA, my faculty, now remember this, even know the debates that went into the making of FEA. Pak Ungku was very clear why this had to be done. To undertake research of complex problems in the world, he felt the need to adopt a multidisciplinary approach. For Pak Ungku, in a university, if we are to reform tertiary education to promote truly meaningful research, the right kind of institutions have to be created. Pak Ungku practiced this view in society too. The appropriate institutions had to be created by the government in order to tackle inequities in society. And this included poverty eradication, wealth and income inequalities, and the exploitation of those on the margin. The institutions that Pak Ungku created included the National Cooperative, ANGKASA, and the Tabung Haji. To reflect on Pak Ungku's achievements as a scholar and institution builder, we selected our speakers very carefully. We wanted those who knew him as a fellow scholar. Today we have with us Professor Syed Hussein Ali and Professor K.S. Jomo, and they will speak on these issues that I have just touched on. Both are scholars of great repute themselves, who research topics close to Pak Ungku's heart. We have today with us Ms. Koo Siew Man, who, because she worked so closely with Pak Ungku, knew what drove him to build these important institutions in this university and in society. And finally, we are glad to have with us Tan Sri Zeti Aziz, Pak Ungku's daughter, who is best placed to reflect on what compelled him to strive to create a more just Malaysia. Since we are focusing today on personal experiences about Pak Ungku, I want to discuss Universiti Malaya's Institute for Advanced Studies, the last institution that he created. Then called the Institute for Graduate Studies, or Institute Pengajian Tinggi, IPT. It was fashioned after the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton University. This institution was conceived in Princeton as a center for interdisciplinary research, to cross boundaries across the disciplines to promote research. I was in the first batch of postgraduate students when IPT was created. We students were surprised when we were told that Pak Ungku himself, then the Vice-Chancellor, though still the Vice-Chancellor, was returning to the classroom to deliver the lectures. What a privilege it was for us to have been taught by Pak Ungku himself. His lectures were not in the discipline of economics. he came to lecture us on philosophy. Pak Ungku wanted us to take a new direction in our research as postgraduate students. He encouraged us to pursue multidisciplinary learning, to read in different disciplines. He felt that this mode of training would help us better understand and analyze serious problems in the world. Pak Ungku taught us to appreciate the complexity of the problems facing Malaysia and the world. And as he noted, a complex web of interconnected issues went into the making of these problems. We could not afford to miss things. And if we do, as Pak Ungku reminded us correctly, we would draw wrong conclusions. And this would then lead us to expound bad policies that only serve to create new problems. We were reminded that the problems we were discussing were not inevitable outcomes of a rapidly industrializing economy, but the results of fixable mistakes of public policy. IPT gave us the freedom to think, to debate these issues, to read deeply, to be exposed to fine academics. Among these academics included Professor K.S. Jomo, who is here with us today, and Professor Lim Teck Gee. In the social sciences, we were required to write full dissertations, a process that allowed us to analyze deeply the problems we were reviewing. The degree that was conferred on us was in the discipline of development studies. At that time, I still remember there was much sniggering about this degree among academics rooted in their respective disciplines. Today, there is a Department of Development Studies in the Faculty of Economics. Today, UM's research in the discipline of development studies is well noted in the world. We owe a great debt to Pak Ungku. When I look back now on IPT, I do so with some regret. To my mind, and this is my personal opinion, we in the social sciences in the University of Malaya could have done better with this institution that Pak Ungku created for us. One that allowed time for young and senior academics to think, to research, and to write about complex problems in Malaysia and in the world. We definitely could have done better by Pak Ungku on this matter. Indeed, Pak Ungku, to my mind, was a scholar way ahead of his time. Today, as we speak, there's a growing debate of the need to promote multidisciplinary teaching and interdisciplinary research and publications. I do wonder why we have not fared as well as we should have, as the foundations laid by Pak Ungku were very sound. There are many reasons for this, but it is not these matters that I want to dwell on today. We will leave that for another day and for another forum. Today, we are gathered to celebrate the life of a great scholar. We are gathered to appreciate and acknowledge the impact that Pak Ungku had on society and on us, academics. We will hear 4 different narratives which will provide insights into different aspects of his life. Today, through these narratives, we will be taken through history of this university, of this country, and of its institutions. Such was the impact of Pak Ungku's life, as he was a key figure in many core institutions in Malaysia. There will be important lessons for us from what we are about to hear about Pak Ungku's life. Today, as I speak, we are debating in this university how to improve our teaching, our curriculum, our research, our supervision. Are we training and inspiring our students in the same way Pak Ungku trained and inspired his students? I am glad to say that we in UM are asking ourselves these questions. An important endeavor, a transformation plan, is being debated. an initiative by our chairman, Tunku Azman Sharifuddin, and by our Vice Chancellor, Prof. Hamdi Shuko, who is here with us today. We are challenging each other to think through the value of our changes that we are proposing. And as we debate the way forward, Pak Ungku's legacy to us academics will be even more crucial. As Pak Ungku showed us through his life and his example, our scholarly work must be informed by well-designed research methods. He told us that when he taught us. Our published work must be based on sound research, well-reviewed by peers, subjected to debates during seminars, all means to force us to think through our propositions. Pak Ungku demanded much of us when he taught us. And these are important lessons I hope we will carry in this university as we move forward. We at FEA will also endeavor to reacquaint ourselves with the works of Pak Ungku, to remind Malaysians of his great legacy to us. A series of events is being planned over the coming year to review Pak Ungku's important scholarly contributions. In today's closing speech by Dr. Rohana Jani of the Ungku Aziz Center for Development Studies, she will speak on these issues. I want to end by thanking our speakers. They immediately agreed to speak when we approached them. We were supposed to host this forum on the 15th of January, the 1-month anniversary of Pak Ungku's demise. But we had to delay it for a number of reasons, including trying to find a time to fit in the Prime Minister. Tan Sri Muhyiddin Yassin was a student of FEA, and he was a student of Pak Ungku. I thank the Prime Minister for taking the time to record his speech, which we will screen today. I thank the organizing committee, ably led by Associate Professor Dr. Shanta Ramu and Dr. Rohana Jani. Organizing this forum was not an easy task. How do you capture in 2 hours the life of Pak Ungku, who left an indelible mark on FEA and not only in a tangible sense, but also in an intellectual sense? I thank the administrative staff of the Ungku Aziz Center. They worked diligently to organize this event. We prepared a short video on the life and times of Pak Ungku. To those who worked on this video tribute, I thank them, as this took much time and effort. Finally, I thank all who are here today, who tuned in to this tribute. We reached out to the FEA alumni to ask them to join us. It is only proper that those of us who benefited from Pak Ungku's tutelage and from the institutions he created should be here today to honor him. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Now, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, let us warmly invite Yang Berbahagia Professor Dato' Insinyur Dr. Muhammad Hamdi Abdul Syukur, Vice Chancellor of Universiti Malaya, for his speech. Please welcome.
Thank you very much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good afternoon to everyone. Yang Berhormat Tan Sri Dato' Haji Muhyiddin Haji Muhammad Yassin, Prime Minister of Malaysia, Yang Mulia Tengku Datuk Dr. Muhammad Azman Sharifuddin, Tengku Ibrahim, the Chairman Board of Directors, University of Malaya, Yang Berusaha Professor Dr. Edmund Terence Gomez, Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Administration, University of Malaya, honorable speakers, ladies and gentlemen. We are really honored today to be with everyone in this very historical event, which we call a tribute to Royal Professor Ungku Abdul Aziz. The presence of distinguished panels and guests, family members and everyone virtually and physically shows that we concern and we want to show our appreciation to what Pak Ungku have done to us and the whole nation. Universiti Malaya is deeply saddened, of course, by the demise of Pak Ungku. He's probably the most renowned scholar and academician that Malaysia has ever had. And we are very grateful to have him as our Vice-Chancellor for almost 2 decades, in fact 2 decades, the longest serving Vice-Chancellor in the history of Malaysia, and the only person who has been bestowed upon the professorship, Professor Diraja. And it would not be wrong to say that he's probably the first to drive this university towards serving the nation and impacting the world. That has been now our main vision of Universiti Malaya. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to very quickly flash back the academic career of Pak Ungku, starting in 1952 as a lecturer of economics in the University of Malaya. He went on to obtain a full professorship, became the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, and then served as the first Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Administration. In 1968, Pak Ungku made history by becoming the first Malaysian to be the Vice-Chancellor of Universiti Malaya. And as I mentioned earlier, he has been serving as the longest Vice-Chancellor for 2 decades. We have witnessed a tremendous intellectual growth in the Universiti Malaya, and what Pak Ungku have done to this university has really set the university in a path that has never occurred before. And what we have seen today is what the Pak Ungku's foundation is all about. He received his royal professorship in 1978 from His Majesty the Yang di-Pertuan Agong, and remained the only person receiving that accolade throughout the whole years until today. There's none other Malaysian who has ever received that title. He retired in 1988 after 20 years serving as a Vice-Chancellor. However, he did not stop serving the university, and he was made the Emeritus Professor, continuously contributing to the University of Malaya in various capacities. Pak Ungku has been bestowed upon with various titles and accolades and awards. To name others is the Ordre des Arts from France, the Grand Cordon of the Order of the Sacred Treasure from Japan, and the Tun Abdul Razak Foundation Award, Malaysia, alongside numerous honorary degrees from universities worldwide. Ladies and gentlemen, Pak Ungku's academic work were known to solve lots of societal problems. For instance, the issue of poverty, which has been very close to his heart, has preoccupied him from the beginning of his academic career. And indeed, the title of his bachelor degree was an economic study of Malay rubber smallholders. So this indicates how closely he was with the society. Pak Ungku's primary concern was with the plight of the poor, especially in rural areas. More so, the poverty rate in 1960s were at the rate of 60%. And his research has led him to formulate what we call as the Sarung Index. I think probably will be elaborated more by my colleagues. Yeah? So this is a measure of poverty, especially the rural poverty. And in his work, interestingly, he pinpointed exploitation and neglect as 2 major causes of poverty and the key obstacles to development of rural communities. And his work was very instrumental in directing or spurring the government at that time to embark on rural development programs, which has helped thousands of people away from poverty. Yeah? So ladies and gentlemen, there are legacies that Pak Ungku has left to all of us, and all of us are very aware of what he has done. As mentioned by Prof. Terence just now, Pak Ungku was responsible for the formation of the Tabung Haji. Yeah? And the roots of this founding of Tabung Haji, it can be traced back to a working paper prepared by him in 1959. And the title of that paper is Plan to Improve the Economy of Prospective Pilgrims. At that time, poor people have got problems in going to Mecca to do Hajj. They have to sell their lands and whatever properties that they have. And this has implications on the family as a whole. So Pak Ungku suggested the formation of a financial institution that will solve the issue of people, the poor people who will be able to go to perform Hajj in Mecca. So this is where Tabung Haji was created, and that has tremendously have impact on all in Malaysia, and now has been the model for other countries as well. A lot of people wanting to learn from what has been the success of Tabung Haji. Pak Ungku also created what we call as ANGKASA, Angkatan Koperasi Kebangsaan Malaysia Berhad, in 1971. And this institution is basically the apex body, the umbrella body for all cooperatives, all the koperasi in Malaysia. And at one point, it has the membership of close to 5,000 cooperatives in Malaysia. And he led this initiative or institution for more than 40 years. Very synonym with ANGKASA. And we also need to mention the role of Pak Ungku in establishing Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka, DBP. Established in 1956, the DBP served to enhance the position of the Bahasa Malaysia, the national language. And it has basically established this DBP, and Pak Ungku have got tremendous impact on the formation of the DBP. The DBP was entrusted with multiple roles at that time, including publishing school textbooks for educational system in transition, conducting research on Malay traditional literature, and developing a modern Malay literature as well. And indeed, Pak Ungku's love of Malay poetry was well known to many people. I was probably one of the young ones, relatively young ones, who have not had chance to be led by Pak Ungku, but we all have seen the impact of his leadership to the university and all the senior professors that we have seen in this university. And truly, today is a time when we want to hear more about his legacy. Distinguished guests, family members, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot honor Pak Ungku enough. And his academic works and ideas have developed Malaysia in various ways. His leadership has produced leaders in various arenas, professors, senior civil servants that we have seen today, entrepreneurs, and the Prime Minister as well, to mention a few. So Pak Ungku was indeed the first towering intellectual in Malaysia who has really moved towards serving the nation and impacting the world. It is an honor to us and a legacy that is going to be a challenge for all the new academics, particularly in Universiti Malaya, to emulate. He has set a very, very high benchmark, and it's going to be a great challenge to all of us to match him or even follow his footsteps. So ladies and gentlemen, we are going to enjoy ourselves today by listening and knowing more about this intellectual of Malaysia named Pak Ungku. Thank you very much. And Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Yang Berbahagia Datuk. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we have invited our Prime Minister, Yang Amat Berhormat Tan Sri Datuk Haji Muhyiddin Haji Muhammad Yassin, to grace today's tribute to Professor Ungku Aziz. The Prime Minister has graciously prepared a special tribute speech for us. With great honor, I would like to invite you all to listen to our Prime Minister's speech.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh dan salam sejahtera. Honorable Professor Dato' Engineer Dr. Muhammad Hamdi Abdul Syukur, the Vice Chancellor, University of Malaya, Professor Dr. Edmund Terence Gomez, Dean, Faculty of Economics and Administration, University of Malaya, honorable speakers, Yang Bahagia Tan Sri Dr. Zeti Akhtar Aziz, Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundram, Dr. Syed Hussein Ali and Mrs. Koo Siu Moon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Apa khabar semua? Alhamdulillah, all praise be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by whose grace and blessings we are able to meet through this virtual platform to pay tribute to Almarhum Royal Professor Ungku Aziz. I wish to thank the Faculty of Economics and Administration, University of Malaya, for inviting me to say a few words. Almarhum Royal Professor Ungku Abdul Aziz bin Ungku Abdul Hamid, or fondly known as Pak Ungku, contributed tremendously to the development of our nation. Almarhum Pak Ungku was an outstanding economist and a great scholar. Personally, I'm proud to be one of his students in Royal Economics at this university in the 1960s. And it is an honor indeed to be educated by a great man like Almarhum Pak Ungku. As the first Malaysian Vice Chancellor of the University of Malaya, he led this university with great distinctions by orienting its focus from one that was inherited from the colonial era into one that is with the nation and for the nation on all major issues. As the leader of this university, Almarhum Pak Ungku paved the way for generations of graduates to be citizens who would propel the country to greater heights in various fields, while at the same time conscious of their history, culture, and identity through various initiatives. Indeed, Almarhum Pak Ungku himself exemplified this aspiration by demonstrating that although he was an economist by training, he cultivated continuous learning on the subject of the humanities, just as the Malay Pantun, the great literatures, philosophies, and religions of the world, hence been regarded as a Renaissance man. Ladies and gentlemen, Almarhum Royal Professor Ungku Aziz, as an economist, had conducted pioneering studies and contributed important ideas to the development of our country, especially in the field of rural development. His understanding of rural poverty and its solutions were based on field research where he himself immersed in the day-to-day life of the rural folks. He ingeniously developed the Sarong Index to measure rural poverty then. And this index was one of his most important contributions that distinguished himself as a great scholar. The Sarong Index also helped us to focus our attention on the need to eradicate poverty, a major perennial social problem in our country in the past decades. Indeed, Malaysia has since managed to reduce poverty tremendously. The numerous awards and recognitions Almarhum Pak Ungku received from many institutions in the world, including the United Nations, testify to the significance of his work. Apart from that, among his most important legacies was the establishment of Lembaga Tabung Haji, which has tremendously benefited the Muslims in this country for many decades now. He was also instrumental in the establishment of the National Cooperative Organization of Malaysia, or ANGKASA, to bring cooperatives together as jointly owned community-based enterprises that strive to enhance the socio-economic condition of the people. Almarhum Pak Ungku stamped his mark as a truly selfless public intellectual whose intelligence has brought about real socio-economic improvements in this country. Ladies and gentlemen, finally, on behalf of the government, I would like to express our highest gratitude for Almarhum Royal Professor Ungku Aziz's contribution to the development of our nation. I would also like to congratulate the Faculty of Economics and Administration, University of Malaya, for organizing this memorial for Almarhum. I sincerely hope that this tribute to Almarhum Pak Ungku will serve as an avenue for all of us to discuss the issue of poverty eradication and equitable development in this country. His life achievement should encourage us to undertake more serious studies on poverty eradication and devise workable strategies to overcome the problem of poverty, especially as we endeavor to recover from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
On behalf of the organizing committee, we would like to give our special thanks to the Prime Minister for his memorable speech. Ladies and gentlemen, the Ungku Aziz Center for Development Studies and the Faculty of Economics and Administration have prepared a video tribute to commemorate Pak Ungku's contributions to the university and the nation. I hope the video will bring back fond memories of the late Pak Ungku.
Jenazah tokoh ekonomi dan pendidikan negara Profesor Diraja Ungku Abdul Aziz Ungku Abdul Hamid selamat dikebumikan kira-kira jam 10 malam tadi. Jenazah dikebumikan di Tanah Perkuburan Islam Bukit Kiara, Ibu Negara.
Sampan kota hile mudik, dayung patah galang sebatang. Ikhtiar tidak datang menggolek, akal tidak datang melayang. That you must remember.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, today we gather to celebrate the life and journey of the great Royal Professor Ungku Abdul Aziz, Opa Ungku, as some of us may call him, who through his work has touched many lives. Now we have arrived to the pinnacle of our programs, tributes by our honorable speakers. We are very fortunate to have among us today 4 special guests to share their experience and association with the late Pak Ungku. Without further ado, I'd like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Syed Hussein Ali, to speak a few words. Dr. Syed Hussein Ali is a prominent politician, academic and social activist, and a former professor in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology in the University Malaya. Let us welcome Dr. Syed Hussein Ali to share his experiences during his long years of services with Professor Ungku. Dr. Syed, can you please unmute? Thank you.
The passing of Ungku Aziz was a great loss to this country as well as to this nation. He was a true Malaysian and one of the greatest in the history of his land. He is highly regarded, especially firstly as a university administrator and institution builder in the university. He was lecturer, dean, and is vice chancellor for more than 20 years. Perhaps the longest vice chancellor in the country, and maybe too one of the longest in the whole world. As vice chancellor, he did not only make the university into an outstanding institution, but he also built and established other institutions within the university. He built, for instance, the institute, the IPT, Institute Pengajian Tinggi, the Postgraduate Studies Institute. He established the Islamic Center, which not only taught Islam but also Islamic civilization. He established the Language Center to train teachers to teach in the university and also to teach several other languages in the world. He also introduced the teaching of philosophy of science and technology. So in other words, he was really not only a great administrator, but also a great institution builder for the university and of the university. Secondly, he was outstanding as a public intellectual and an academician. As an academician, although he was generally an economist, but he was on rural development. He taught the subject at the university. He did research all over the country, and he wrote about them. And he also suggested to the government development project in order to improve the country and in order to overcome poverty, especially rural poverty. And contributions were not just in this field. There were many others. For instance, he was active in the Malay language and literature movement. He was in the Persatuan Bahasa Melayu Universiti Malaya. He was involved with literary and academic work in the country for a long time. And he organized congresses. He also collected, studied, and wrote on the Malay traditional pantun. In fact, he wrote a book based on 87 pantun, which were selected studiously from 16,000 pantun that he had gathered. And apparently later, he gathered many more. And it was said that he had already selected 40,000. And nobody really, scholar or otherwise, has selected pantun in this country. He was also interested in the arts. He was interested and promoted. He organized in the university several art exhibitions. And later he set up a gallery for Asian art. He was also deeply interested in the field of science and technology. And following this, established departments or courses for students to follow. He was not involved in politics, especially in party politics. Very closely. He was invited by the political party to be its leader, but of course he turned it down because his first love was in the academia. But he was involved with the political activities. For instance, he gave talks to political parties on poverty, on economics, and he even gave lectures in the training courses that were run by Socialist Front for its leaders and cadres. Finally, of course, he built or gave ideas for the building of various other institutions, not just confined to the university, most of which were the Pilgrimage Fund Board or Tabung Haji, and the Cooperative Organization for Malaya or ANGKASA. So we see that Ungku Aziz was a man of thought. He is indeed well regarded as a Renaissance man, and rightly so. I came into contact with Ungku Aziz in 1956 when I entered the University of Malaya, which was then in Singapore. He was already lecturing in the economics faculty for 4 years. Besides lecturing in that faculty, he also gave some lectures in the department in the art faculty. I followed his lectures in both the economics department as well as Malay Studies department. But he was not just a teacher. He was also involved in certain activities with the university. At that time, there was a PBMUM, Persatuan Bahasa Melayu Universiti Malaya, Malay Language Society. Essentially, it was a society. But Ungku Aziz, as a lecturer, got very interested in the activities of. In fact, he was on a committee that Persatuan. When I became secretary and later president of PBMUM, I became much closer to and on several occasions, he invited me. For instance, he often hosted leading economics in Indonesia, England, America, and Europe to his house in this country. And very often, he would invite me to be in the house to participate in the discussions that took place then. At the same time, he often went from Singapore in Malaya then, in the peninsula. He visited paddy farmers, he visited rubber smokers, and he visited them not only to study their problems, but also to designate his ideas on poverty and development to them, because he felt that all these matters need to be known, especially by people. During his trips to various places, he would be talking about all kinds of things, all kinds of subjects. This showed his vast knowledge of things on various subjects. In fact, he was a very voracious reader. During my association with him, in my interaction with him, I observed one special thing. Ungku Aziz, in his life and his work, combined two aspects that are important in knowledge, which are theory and practice. He had several theories on things, but he was not thinking about those things. He always tried to do something to make his ideas and theories materialize into programs and into projects that can help the development of the country. There are many examples I can show on this, but I intend to focus only on two aspects. One aspect is Malay language, and the other aspect is, of course, Ungku Aziz believed in the Malay language, and that it can and should be a means of communication, a lingua franca in the whole of Nusantara. whole of Southeast Asia, but also it should be a medium of instruction from lower to higher education up to the university. Because he is interested in this, because in theory he believes that this ought to happen, he made sure that he would actively get him involved in activities or projects to improve the Malay language. And that is why I said just now, to participate in activities of Persekutuan Bahasa Melayu. Now, he knew that his Bahasa Malaysia was not that good. So he tried very hard to improve his Bahasa Malaysia. And he did this particularly by asking the help of leading writers, people like Osman Awang, a well-known poet, and Christmas, or kalau teman Muhammad, a well-known short story writer. Very often, he would translate some short stories, especially by Lu Xun from China. He translated them, showed them to these writers, they would correct them, and then he would publish them in Utusan Melayu. At the same time, very often he would invite these writers to his house, not only to talk about language, to discuss the language, but also to talk and discuss about literature, especially Malay literature. But his activities were beyond the university and the home. He interacted with various Malay language and literature societies all over the country. When the third language congress, Malay Language and Literature Congress, was going to be held in Singapore and Johor Bahru in 1956, Ungku Aziz managed to persuade the organizers to hold the conference within the University of Malaya. He organized most necessary things that had to be done in the university. He was a very concerned organizer and very persistent in making sure that things ran smoothly. In fact, the third Congress was one of the best organized out of the 8 that had been organized until now. Now, the idea of having this Congress was mainly to standardize the spelling in Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, and such like, and also to standardize, if possible, the language of these countries. There was much demand in getting the standardization of spelling, but standardization of language did not succeed as much as the spelling. But what is important in that? Another resolution of the Congress was that an agency called the Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka should be established in order to promote literature. Because that was part of the group that pushed for the agency. When it was established, he was made the first. He did not refuse to be to the appointment. he took it as a challenge while still lecturing at the university and started organizing and setting the base for the development of Dewan Rasa. But he did not stay locally for 1 year. From this serious example, I am trying to illustrate that in the field of language, it's not only a belief or theory on the real language, but he took action to make sure that these theories and beliefs would materialize not only in institutions, but also in activities that will promote. And this he did. He combined the two. In the field of economics, he was, of course, involved with economics and development, which he taught, which he studied, and which he wrote on. In his study of poverty, he produced theory that the main causes of poverty were low productivity, exploitation, and government neglect. Now, these are theories that he established from his studies. Now, with these theories, he wanted to make sure that not only students who follow his lectures would know about the subject, but he wanted also the general public to be aware of them. He believed that the general public knew his theory on poverty and development, then there is greater possibility for action to be taken, especially by government, to improve the condition of the rural Malays. That is why he went around to various parts of the country. And as I said, when he went around, he talked, among others, of poverty and rural development. He was very close to the Satuan Tabung Kecil Association in Johor. This is on smallholders in Johor, for which he got first class economics honors degree, but also because he felt that those people didn't help. He was close to the association, and he was very close to the president of that association. He constantly visited them to advise them on.
Thank you, Prof. Can I kindly ask you to summarize? Thank you. Can I kindly ask you to summarize?
Okay, yeah, okay, I'll summarize. Well, now, of course, not only that, he also organized a program called economics, where he and some lecturers gave talks on economics, especially on rural poverty. As I said just now, he wanted the public to know about it. There were thousands of people who followed that radio series. Now, besides that, he also saw the need for establishing institutions, and there were two important institutions that he set up, which have been mentioned earlier by others. One was Tabung Haji, in Tabung Haji, he saw the need for the rural people who often went to Hajj to save money. Sometimes after saving the money, they buy land or cattle, and before Hajj, they sell land or cattle. Now, he suggested that there should be the Tabung Haji established. He wrote a short article of half a page, which later was adopted as a basis for forming the Tabung Haji. The other important institution that he established was the cooperative movement. He established a cooperative bookshop in the Universiti Malaya. And more important, of course, he established the ANGKASA, the movement, the cooperative. Now, we saw just now that he according to him, one of the causes of poverty was exploitation. And to overcome exploitation, not only big exploiters, big capitalists, but also the rural middlemen, they needed to be cooperative so that people participated in production and distribution of their goods. And so that there won't be exploitation, so that there will be improvement in their life. So we can summarize, therefore, that equality is not satisfied just by having ideas and having theories. He wanted them to be implemented, and he ensured that his activities will also involve the creating and establishment of institutions which can not only overcome poverty but create greater development, especially among the rural people, the majority of whom are Malays. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Syed Hussein Ali. Our second speaker, Mrs. Kusiuman, served as a chief librarian from 1984 to 1993. Prior to that, she was an academician at the Faculty of Economics and Administration with Professor Ungku. Now I would like to invite our second speaker, Mrs. Kusiuman, to deliver her tribute speech. Please welcome.
Thank you. Prof. Vice-Chancellor, Prof. Dekan, Dr. Hana, distinguished audience. First, I would like to thank the Faculty of Economics and Administration and the Ungku Aziz Center for so kindly inviting me to today's event. I would also like to say a big thank you to the support team who has been so kind in helping me out. Well, librarians only know much about books, and this is why my viewpoint, my take for today will be on Ungku's writings and his research. Ungku's known body of research spanned over a period of something like 5 decades. And I would like to begin by recalling some of his early works and his early research. In 1940, Ungku entered Raffles College, but his studies were interrupted by the war. In 1947, he re-entered Raffles, and in the same year was awarded his Dip Arts. The title of his thesis, can we see this thing? Yes. The title of his thesis was An Economic Study of Malay Rubber Smallholders. That's right, this is the one. This is an indication of Ungku's interest, which was to stay with him all the rest of his life. In 1949, the Raffles College merged with the King Edward VII College of Medicine, and thus was born the University of Malaya. Ungku joined the university and was a student from 49 to 51. And in 1951, he graduated with a first-class honors in economics, a rare distinction in those days. And the title of his thesis was Some Preliminary Observations on Latex and the Malayan Smallholder. In 1952, Ungku was appointed a lecturer in the Department of Economics, Faculty of Arts, University of Singapore, University of Malaya, then in Singapore. He taught the course on rural economics, and I was a student in to that course. And he taught the course until 1961. By the mid-60s, Ungku had already produced a fair body of writings on the rural economy, focusing on rural poverty and exploring the existence and the nature of poverty and its causes. Examples are Facts and Fallacies of the Malay Economy, published in 1957. Another early publication in 1956 was Rencana Ekonomi dan Kemiskinan. It was a series of essays dealing with poverty of rural communities like fishermen, and included an essay that he was to revisit from time to time, called Zahir dan Batin Ekonomi Melayu. In 1956, he published Causes of Poverty in Malayan Agriculture. Ungku also proposed various strategies to alleviate or eradicate poverty. The Remedy for Rural Poverty was published in 1956. And Prof. Vice-Chancellor, you mentioned this earlier on. Ungku proposed a strategy to assist poor Muslims who wanted to perform the Hajj. In 1959, Ungku submitted a memo called A Pilgrim's Economy Improvement Plan, and he submitted this to the government. The Pilgrim's Economic Welfare Committee studied it, and in 1962 adopted the plan, resulting in the establishment of what was later to be called the Tabung Haji. Ungku proposed also strategies which are more broad-based, not just targeted at any specific group, but broad-based. And one of them, again, which he was to be interested in for the rest of his writing career, was cooperation. Cooperative ideology was published in 1966, as was Cooperation and National Development. Ungku's concepts on poverty were consolidated in a 74 essay called Footprints on the Sands of Time. Ungku always was very poetical. He loved poetry, and this is taken from a poem that he liked. Footprints on the Sands of Time, the Malay poverty concept over 50 years, from Sabah to Aziz and the Second Malaysia 5-year plan. Sabah too was a hero for Ungku. And Ungku had many other heroes, Confucius, and so on. Footsteps on the Sands of Time was also published in Bahasa Malaysia called Jejak-Jejak di Pantai Zaman, published a year later in 1975. I would like now to recall some of Ungku's key research projects that addressed national problems and led to their resolution. By 1959, Ungku had been appointed, he had been sounded out as head, but in 1961, he formally took up the appointment as head of Department of Economics, by this time in Lembah Pantai, this present campus. 1961 was a very busy year for Ungku, because he brought into the department 2 very big projects. One of the earlier ones was the traffic flow through Port Swettenham, forecast to 1975. I was the research assistant to this project, and he had recruited me as a fresh graduate. I was a very nervous fresh graduate. The traffic flow through Port Swettenham was conducted between 61 and 63. Ungku headed the project and was assisted by 3 staff, 2 from the Department of Economics and 1, a mathematician from the Department of Mathematics, who studied the queuing problems which was faced by shipping companies at Port Swettenham. The project cost of $62,000 was funded by the Ministry of Transport, and the report was published by the Department of Economics in 1964. The findings supported the Port Authority's plan to build deep water berths for the port. In those days, without deep water berths, you cannot actually export things like palm oil. It's impossible to take them out into what they call the outer roads. So the building of these deep water berths helped in initially in the export of palm oil, but later on in the export of petroleum. The most significant project for Ungku and for the department in that year was the project on subdivision of estates in Malaya, 1951 to 1960. This was published by the Department of Economics in 1962, and Ungku wrote the first volume, Volume 1. This was the main report, and he edited the volumes 2 and 3, which were on different parts of the specific states of Malaya. For this project, Ungku was conferred the Doctor of Economics ANGKASA by Waseda University, Tokyo, in 1964. At the same time that he was handling all these projects, he also brought in other projects such as the rice economy at Tanjung Karang, squatters in Klang, survey of Petaling Jaya, and these and other projects kept Ungku and the department rather busy for the rest of the 60s. Many of us have benefited from Ungku's writings, and I thought you might like to know how they many of them originated from handwritten notes that had to be deciphered nervously by his secretaries. While Ungku is well known for his works on poverty and other topics in economics, it should be remembered that Ungku wrote extensively on education, especially when he was VC, during the period when he was VC from 1968 to 1988. Topics included access and entry into Malaysian universities, and this essay was very important for people who wanted to know how students were accepted into local universities. And they also wrote on the adoption of the national language as the medium of instruction at tertiary level. And this was a hotly debated subject, and so many people looked forward to this particular essay. He also made a suggestion to the government to reform the scholarship fund. Looking to the future, he also wrote an essay on what the university should be in the future. Apart from academic contributions, Ungku had many interests and was a man of diverse expertise that he used to advance the university's aesthetic and cultural development. Let's take architecture. The design of FEA's dome, round dome, and the round center core was actually Ungku's idea, and he discussed that exhaustively with the architects. His ideas have made the FEA rather unique, I think, on campus. Regarding objects of art, the Candy collection at the Seni Museum Asia actually came from the Singapore campus. When the University of Malaya was divided up into University of Singapore and University of Malaya, some of the common properties were also divided. And the Candy was chosen by Ungku to belong to the University of Malaya, Lembah Pantai. Today, it is one of the best in the world, if not the best. As for music, Ungku was an aficionado of Malay traditional music. In 1980, he invited Hamzah Dolmat and his group to compose and to record their music in the library, University of Malaya. And I was one of those who were very pleased about this because we would go and listen every Wednesday when Hamzah Dolmat and his group would come. And over 1980 and 1983, over 500 pieces of music, including Keroncong and Ghazal, was recorded with Hamzah Dolmat himself playing the gambus and the Oud. Regarding art, when Ibrahim Hussein returned to Malaysia from the United Kingdom, Ungku appointed him resident artist at UM. In addition to offering free classes in art to students and staff, the artist painted frescoes in different parts of the campus, adding a touch of beauty to some rather boring buildings. I should like to end by touching on Ungku's extraordinary ability to maintain long-standing relationships with professional organizations in which he took an interest. Examples are, as you have pointed out, Prof. ANGKASA, the national cooperative body, which he headed for 40 years, KKUM, the University of Malaya Cooperative Bookshop, of which I was the secretary, and which he headed for over 30 years. ASAHIL, the Association of Southeast Asian Institutions of Higher Learning, of which Ungku was associated as president for 15 years, UNESCO and others. I can do no better than to elaborate a little bit to describe Ungku's professional connection with the Persatuan Ekonomi Malaysia, or PEM. In June 1962, a small group of economists from the university, the public sector and the private sector got together and founded the Persatuan Ekonomi Malaysia, PEM. Ungku was elected PEM's first president from 1963 to 1966, and later he was appointed chairman of the editorial board. He held this post for 24 years, from 65 to 89. In this capacity, Ungku was responsible for publishing the Journal of the PEM, which he named the Kajian Ekonomi Malaysia. The first issue of the Kajian was published in the June of 74, June of 64. And Ungku had an article, I think, in this issue as well. Many of Ungku's important papers saw first light, either as an article in the Kajian or were presented at PM seminars. Poverty, Proteins, and Starvation was published in the second issue. And his famous Footprints on the Sands of Time was presented at PEM's first economic convention in the March of 74. One can also surmise that since Ungku was the president of PEM, when he was also the head of the Department of Economics, that it's likely that he offered the department as home to PEM. Anyway, 50 years later, the PEM office is still in the FEA. In turn, the PEM demonstrated its deep appreciation to Ungku in various ways. In 1977, PEM presented to Ungku his first Festschrift, entitled Some Cases on Poverty in Malaysia, Essays Presented to Professor Ungku Aziz. And I edited this as a joint editor with Professor Dr. Mokhzani Abdul Rahim. In 2002, PEM organized a dinner for over 2,000 people to celebrate Ungku's 80th birthday. The program for the evening was entitled Honoring an Extraordinary Malaysian, Royal Professor Ungku A. Aziz, on the occasion of his 80th birthday. This program, which I also did, featured contributions from Ungku's students, staff, colleagues, and friends. In April 2015, PEM adopted a resolution to reprint Ungku's most significant works so as to make them available and accessible worldwide. The project was a collaborative effort between PEM, the University of Malaya Library, and the University of Malaya Press. In 2017, the project was completed, and the publication entitled Royal Professor Ungku A. Aziz, Writing for the Nation, was presented to Ungku the same year. I must say at this point that Ungku was quite pleased with the title and was gracious, very gracious about the 5 books. This was the presentation to Ungku by our President, Tan Sri Sulaiman. This 5-volume work contains 120 titles, including all thesis material by Ungku, all reports of major reports by Ungku, his inaugural lecture, and his major papers. This publication is gifted to institutions and libraries because the PEM did not want to make this a profit-making project. So it's gifted to institutions and libraries upon their written request to either PEM or the Ungku Aziz Center. It's also gifted to individuals who have made contributions to PEM's development. At the current moment, this publication is available at the National Library of Malaysia, the University of Malaya, and many other academic, public, special, and government libraries throughout Malaysia. It is available also in many libraries overseas, including the British Library, the Library of Congress, and the National Library of France. In conclusion, we can say that through his research and writings, Ungku was instrumental in effecting institutional changes that have improved the life of countless numbers of the rural poor and freed an entire rural sector from abject poverty. Along the way, Ungku was a respected mentor and an admired teacher to generations of Malaysians who, in their own turn, have contributed to national development. Ungku has left us a legacy that is unlikely to be repeated ever again. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Kusiuman. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram to deliver his tribute speech. Dr. Jomo is a prominent Malaysian economist and a former professor in the Applied Economics Department, Faculty of Economics and Administration, Universiti Malaya, until November 2004. He has also received honors and awards for his work, including the 2007 Wesley Leontief Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought. Please welcome Dr. Jomo.
Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum and good afternoon to all. Let me thank the Faculty of Economics and Administration, University of Malaya, for this kind invitation to join you this afternoon. And let me extend my condolences on behalf of myself and my family to Tan Sri Zeti and her family on their loss. But this is, of course, a loss not only to Tan Sri Zeti, but a loss to the nation. I find that my intended challenge today, this afternoon, has been made much, much easier by many of the preceding speeches. I was going to focus on 2 aspects of Pak Ungku's life. One, some of his major institutional contributions, and we have already heard how some of the major ones have been referred to by almost all previous speakers. And the second thing I would like to do is to dwell a little bit on his major intellectual contributions. I think it's not wrong to begin with his role in the establishment of the Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka and his role in the promotion of Malay letters. Having been born and spending his first few years of life in London, of a mother who was originally French and a grandmother who was Circassian, it is not surprising if he had taken a different path. But he chose to take a path less well taken, which was to dedicate himself to this country. And he chose, for instance, not to go and study abroad, not to follow his father to the University of Cambridge or to Oxford, for instance, which all of these were options available to him at that time. But instead, he chose to study at Raffles College and subsequently study and work at the University of Malaya. This, I think, is a very unusual choice, particularly for somebody as privileged as he was, but it gives us a hint of the other choices he made. As the Dean reminded us, this was an option, he made an option for the poor. And this was something which is extremely important for us to recognize, that despite being born into some privilege, and despite having many other options available to him, he chose to work for the nation. And therefore, the choice of the title of the 5 volumes, which Mrs. Koo has just reminded us of, is most apt, Serving the Nation. Pak Ungku is of course known to many as a Renaissance man, a man of letters, a man who was interested in the arts, but ultimately, I think philosophically speaking, it would not be unfair to describe him as a person who appreciated the importance of ilm, of science. And so even his choice of art, of art and the promotion of that art reflected a very interesting combination. Mrs. Koo referred to him being invited to Ibrahim Hussein being invited as a fellow of 5th College at the University of Malaya. And there are many others who could be mentioned in this regard as well. Arif Ahmad, who, for example, helped to set up the Pusat Budaya at the University of Malaya, was a significant cultural figure in his own right to begin with. He honored the late Pak Sako, Ishak Haji Muhammad, who had been detained under the Internal Security Act in the mid-60s as the leader of the Labour Party at that time. And as Professor Syed Hussein reminded us, Pak Ungku spoke at training camps of the Socialist Front, including the Labour Party at that time. So Pak Ungku was a man of many talents, many abilities, but ultimately one who served the nation. So we talk about his role, particularly in promoting Malay letters. I think it's very important to recognize that this was not in a very narrow way. While he was teaching in Singapore, he, for example, he was among those, besides those in Utusan Melayu, who inspired the students of Nanyang University, a Chinese medium university, to set up a program for the study of Malay letters. This is something which is not terribly well known, but it was people like Ungku Aziz and Utusan Melayu who inspired this kind of choice, this sense of what the new nation should be about. I'm not in a position to go into details, and others are better qualified to go into details about the Dewan Bahasa, but I think it is useful for us to move on quickly to recognize another institution which he was very influential in setting up, Tabung Haji. As Mrs. Koo has reminded us, the first note he drew up on this was from the late 1950s. And subsequently, of course, Tabung Haji itself was set up as an institution in the early 1960s. The reasons we have already heard about. But it's important for us to recognize that this institution was set up 2 decades ahead of penerapan nilai-nilai Islam, 2 decades before the major Islamic institutions during the early period of tenure of Tun Dr. Mahathir in his first incarnation as a Prime Minister. These were institutions which, in a sense, were ahead of his time. They sought to address the Malay concerns about receiving interest and benefiting from interest, but at the same time, they sought to address a problem, as we have already heard, about saving institutions not being available for those, particularly for those who sought to fulfill their duty as Muslims to try to go on the pilgrimage. Yet another a very major institution which Ungku Aziz was very closely associated with, of course, are the institutions of higher education. We have heard from Mrs. Koo, from Professor Syed Hussein, from the Vice Chancellor, and from the Dean about his various contributions in this regard. And I do not want to dwell on them too much. But there are so many aspects of his contributions at that time which I think are perhaps not captured by simply looking at the institutional history of the development of the University of Malaya, or the development of the Faculty of Economics, or even the Department of Economics. It's very important, for example, to recognize how he chose to establish the University of Malaya Press, and to develop and promote the University of Malaya Press as the foremost press in the country to try to develop a body of knowledge, which would be appropriate for the new nation which he saw himself as building. This is, I think, very important. So he published for many years the magazine called Courier, which was published in the United Nations language, 5 United Nations languages from Paris, the magazine called Courier, and he published a Malay version of this. But he was very mindful to try to make it accessible also to Indonesia, to Indonesians. So the Malay he sought to promote was a Malay which, in a sense, was a pan-Malay view of what the language should be. And this, I think, was also very important. There were many other institutions he was associated with. Later, he was associated with things like the exam syndicate and so on and so forth. But this is familiar ground for those of you who have been following this session. But the fourth institution, which has also been commented on by others, I think is very important for us to recognize. And that is the cooperative movement. The cooperative movement, as we have already heard mentioned by many of the previous speakers, was, of course, not seen as simply yet another institution, but rather an alternative way of organizing economic life. And this is not unimportant. This is not unimportant. And in this regard, I think it is appropriate for us to recognize the role of the two Aziz, Ungku Aziz, of course, and also Aziz Ishaq. Aziz Ishaq was, for those with longer memories, the first Minister of Agriculture and Cooperatives. But he had started his working life in the Cooperatives department. His own father was an official, an officer in the Agriculture department, and who had ended up in Singapore working in the Fisheries department in Singapore. And that's where Yusof Ishaq and Aziz Ishaq grew up. Yusof Ishaq, of course, became famous as the first president of Singapore, but precisely because he had been, before that, the pioneering publisher of Utusan Melayu, a very, very major institution in terms of the development of Malay letters, the development of Malay journalism, and of course, of the forging of the nation itself. This is a story, unfortunately, which has not been well told yet, but nonetheless, a story which is extremely important. And in this regard, the role of Ungku Aziz's wife, Azza Aziz, was extremely important because she provided a very, very important link. And today, on the occasion of Women's Day, I think it is very important for us to recognize her role as well, her role in this, because in a sense, she opened up a world which was largely unreached by men to many of Ungku Aziz's ideas, but also in turn, Ungku Aziz in turn was articulating many ideas which he learned from ANGKASA, as we used to call her. Now, I think it's very important for us to recognize in this regard that the cooperative movement, although initially promoted by the colonial administration, as we can see in the works of people like Tim Harper and Richard Stubbs, it was part of the counterinsurgency campaign. It was part of winning hearts and minds, so to speak, in the 1950s. But the cooperative movement also became a tremendous way by which the Malay peasantry was mobilized. And as we've heard from Professor Syed Hussein, it was offered an opportunity to reorganize, for instance, the marketing differently. But if we look very carefully at the development of the cooperative movement, especially in its heady early years in the late 1950s and early 1960s, it attempted to develop in a variety of other areas. The reason why Aziz Ishaq had to leave was eventually removed as agriculture minister and finally left the cabinet to join the Socialist Front, heading a new party, was precisely because of the challenge he posed. He posed a challenge not only to the rice millers and others who were very influential and entrenched in the ruling in the MCA, in the Malayan Chinese Association. It was known at that time in the countryside. This was a very they represented the interests of businessmen in rural Malaya at that time, and we have to remember that much of the population of the country, more than 80% of the country, was to be found in the countryside at that time, and of course Aziz Ishaq was sought to establish a urea company, a chemical company, which would offer production of fertilizers for the farmers. This was a different way of doing things, and this was why the cooperative movement was a major challenge, and part of the reason why Ungku Aziz's contribution to the cooperative movement becomes all the more important in terms of being seen as an alternative way of doing things. Because today, as we know, sometimes people can't even distinguish between cooperate and corporate. And this is a very unfortunate development in our culture, in our language itself. Let me now quickly turn to his three major intellectual contributions as I see it. I think we have already heard a great deal from Professor Syed Hussein, but also from some of the earlier speakers about his contributions, particularly in the area of poverty, in terms of deepening our understanding of poverty, especially rural poverty. And this, I think, was very, very important contribution, as we all agree. I think what is perhaps less well known is how controversial his suggestion of a sarong index was. It might seem obvious to people at that time that the sarong and the accumulation of sarongs by the people in the countryside was an index of the relative wealth of people in the countryside. This is not obvious to people today, but it's very important because we have great difficulties in understanding well-being. Of course, today people like to use monetary income as a measure of well-being, but we know historically that this is not necessarily a very good measure of well-being. If you look, for instance, at the contrasting welfare of the poorer rice farmer compared to the much more well-to-do rubber smallholder, for instance. The children of poorer rice farmers tend to be healthier because of the supplementary sources of nutrition. And this is the significance of Ungku Aziz's emphasis on poverty, on protein poverty, which is a very important dimension of what he sought to try to convey to others. But move on very quickly, and Mrs. Koo and Professor Syed Hussein both mentioned the question of exploitation. Poverty can always be attributed to having the wrong ideas, as in the 1980s, for instance, Professor Syed Hussein Alatas, who had to repudiate those who were talking about the myth, or still promoting the ideas about the myth of the lazy native, or those who emphasized the poor having the wrong ideas, as implied by the book titled Revolusi Mental. All these were ideas which were very, very influential, and I would argue still influential today, albeit in new forms. And this is something which I think we need to recognize. So the last point, I think, which is important for us to recognize, besides the recognition of exploitation, which has to do, of course, with a number of elements of life, and not only marketing, but also he put a great deal of emphasis, Ungku Aziz put a great deal of emphasis on the questions of credit, and which was taken up by the late Moghzani Abdul Rahim, one of his students, and of course the question of land, the importance of land, as people like Syed Hussein Ali himself have elaborated on. But the last point I want to emphasize, which I think is very important for us to appreciate the title of the book, Serving the Nation, and the milieu in which Pak Ungku grew up, was basically what I would call his nationalism. He wrote a couple of articles on this subject, one most famously with T.H. Silcock, the head of the Department of Economics at that time. And it was not a very topic then as it is now. But I think it's very important for us to recognize that Ungku Aziz was responding to the challenge of the times as he saw it, the challenge of building a new nation for which there was no simple formula. There was no simple formula, and he recognized the need to forge this new nation. And in many of his writings, I think it's very important for us to recognize that he saw the major challenge for our times as that of nation building. And so the transition in Jejak-Jejak di Pantai Zaman, or Footprints in the Sands of Time, from Sabah to Aziz, was not only a transition in terms of the development of ideas, of new ideas about poverty and exploitation, but also very, very fundamentally about what was needed to forge the nation, what was needed to create the nation. And as we know in the new economic policy, it sought to create the conditions for forging a new nation by eradicating poverty and by affirmative action to reduce inter-ethnic disparities. This failed, and again, this challenge was taken up later in the Vision 2020, in Tun Mahathir's Vision 2020, where it talks about forging a Malaysian nation. Unfortunately, more than six decades after Malaya got independence, we find ourselves still far from forging that nation. But for Ungku Aziz, it is important for us to recognize the nation was one not determined by genealogy, but rather it was determined by patriotism. And this, I think, is Ungku Aziz's lasting legacy, and he has passed the baton to us. And I do hope that we have earned it and we will carry it on. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jomo. Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is Tan Sri Dr. Zeti Aziz. As we all know, Tan Sri Dr. Zeti is a daughter to Allahyarham Professor Ungku Aziz. Tan Sri Zeti was the 7th governor of Malaysia's central bank and was the first woman in the position. In 2009, Global Finance named her as one of the world's best central bank chief. Let us all welcome Tan Sri Dr. Zeti Aziz for her tribute speech.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much for this to the University of Malaya, to the Faculty of Economics and Administration, and to the Center for Development Studies for this tribute for my father. My father's greatest contribution has already been mentioned at length, and it relates to his pioneering works on poverty, poverty eradication, and rural development that can be found in his writing since the early 1950s. He was a man before his time, because this was all well before international attention was brought to these issues following the adoption of the United Nations Millennium Goals in the year 2000. These early works led to the implementation of policies for the eradication of poverty and for rural development and for balanced growth. This is his legacy. His research showed that poverty amongst the poor not only affect their lives, the lives of these segments of the population, but it also affected their future prospects. He also stressed that although poverty was not confined to any racial group, it was most severe amongst the Malays that predominantly were in the rural areas. A story that's not very well known is that as a young man, my father was noticed by Guna Myrdal, the author of the Asian drama, An Inquiry into the Poverty of Nations, which came out in 1968. And later, he became a Nobel laureate. Well, he visited Singapore in the 1950s and had invited my father to return with him to work in Stockholm. Guna Myrdal expressed great disappointment when my father turned down this opportunity. It was my father's strong sense of patriotism and his strong drive to serve his own country and work towards achieving the upliftment of the economic well-being of the people of our country. He was also a person before his time in the area of financial inclusion, which has only now in these recent few decades become important. His writing, and it was mentioned that Tabung Haji, his works that led to the establishment of Tabung Haji began in the mid-night and late 1950s. Actually, it began with his paper in 1952, which was presented in Bangkok at an e-cafe meeting. The paper was entitled The Mobilization of Rural Savings. He mentions that during the period of colonization, attention was not given to addressing the need to raise rural incomes and their well-being. He found in his empirical research that no matter how poor the rural population was, the Malays would save little by little for the purposes of performing the Hajj at least once in their lifetime. He also saw, as has been mentioned, how they sell their assets or pledge their assets that included livestock and land for this purpose. While the government had made an announcement for the establishment of such an entity in January of 1962, there was one remaining issue that concerned the payment of dividend and whether it was in conformity with the Sharia principles. To resolve this, in 1962, Sheikh Mahmoud Shaltut, the rector of the University of Al-Azhar University, who was also the Mufti Agung of Egypt, was invited to Kuala Lumpur to examine this. As was told to me later by my father's colleague at the university, Zaki Badawi, an Egyptian who taught at the University of Malaya, said that following my father's presentation, Sheikh Mahmoud Shaltut beckoned my father forward. He then embraced my father and told him that there was only one thing wrong with a proposal that the idea had not been thought of by an Egyptian. Well, following that meeting on the 30th of September 1963, Tabung Haji commenced to accept deposits. In recognition of my father's role in its establishment, my father was given the honor of being the first depositor. This outcome led to the establishment of the first Islamic financial institution in Malaysia. He had persevered from 1952 for about a decade to see its establishment that not only allowed for small savings from the rural community to be mobilized and invested and then to generate returns for the savers, but that the investments also contributed to the overall economic development. The war had interrupted my father's education at Raffles College. During the Japanese occupation, the Japanese had sent my father to study at Waseda University, and this is a photograph of when he was there. When the war was ending, he managed to return to Malaya, which he describes to be a miraculous journey that he managed to reach home. He told me that the Tokugawa family in Japan had helped put him on a train that took him to the port to board a Red Cross boat in the midst of bombs that were falling in that area. Soon after he returned, he resumed his education at the University of Malaya in Singapore. In 1946, he married my mother, and they were childhood sweethearts. My grandmother had wanted my mother to continue her education. She was always top in her class and talented in many areas. But my father convinced my grandmother that my mother, would receive the best education being married to him. She married him at the age of 18, and my grandmother arranged for the marriage despite objections from her father's side that maintained that she marries a Said. Well, I was born the following year in 1947, and as a little girl, I recall long walks along the seafront of Johor Bahru so that we would not disturb my father's studies. He graduated in 1951, and as Kusuman has mentioned, from the University of Malaya, with first-class honors, and then he joined as a lecturer in the Department of Economics. And on the occasion, which has also been mentioned, of my father's 80th birthday, a dinner was organized by the Malaysian Economic Association that was attended by several hundred of the economic community in Kuala Lumpur. I learned about an incident that happened during my father's studies at Raffles College. I should also mention amongst the guests of honor that evening was the President of Singapore, S.R. Nathan. He and his wife had a close relationship with my family in their Johor days, and my parents had encouraged him to enroll as a student at the university, working with him and encouraging him to make the submissions of his application. Well, during the dinner, several speakers, and I think Kusuman also mentioned this, gave tributes to my father from their personal engagement with him. One of the speakers, the then head of economics department at the University of Malaya, and later he became chief economist at Bank Negara Malaysia, Siu Nim Chi, who is never restrained in his remarks. He mentioned that my father was the only person that Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew ever lost an election to, He was referring to the elections for the Honorary Secretary of Raffles College Students' Union, which was then in Singapore. I later learned more details of this episode from my father and from the late Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs. A group of students had been unhappy with my father's response to some of their complaints that they had raised. And there was a move then for an extraordinary general meeting to censure him and remove him from office. Well, the candidate fielded to challenge him was Lee Kuan Yew. In his memoirs, he mentioned that it was his first taste of racialism and that it was the Malays that carried the day for my father. My father didn't share this view. While his work on rural poverty did focus on the plight of the Malays, who were the majority living in the rural areas at that time, the manner in which he managed the university later was certainly not along racial lines. On the contrary, the following video from BBC demonstrates his non-racial outlook. Please share with me.
The University of Malaya has fine modern buildings and little racial divisions. The government's best answer to the problem of multiracialism is education. The aim is free primary education for all, and secondary education mainly in Malay and English. Education is designed to give a Malayan outlook. By living together and working together, young people of all races are learning the tolerance without which Malaya cannot exist, and the know-how to run the country. Teaching staff comes from every race in Malaya and from many different parts of the world. Nigel Ryan went to talk to Ungku Abdul Aziz, Professor of Economics and a world expert on the economics of Southeast Asia. He asked Professor Aziz what he felt about the plan for a greater Malaysia.
Well, as a long-term plan from the Malayan point of view, I should say ultimately it will be to our benefit. But within that long term, we may have a number of setbacks, because if we bring in the Borneo territories, including Brunei and of course Singapore, then we might find ourselves short of personnel, for one thing. And the Chinese population of Malaya is almost equal the Malay population. Do you think this is a possible cause of future racial trouble? I don't think the problem is so much a racial problem. I think I'm a bit unorthodox in my approach. I think that there is definitely an economic problem that sometimes appears to have racial undertones or even a racial problem. But really what it is that the majority of the rural people are Malays. And the majority of the people who are trading in rural produce, who are buying the fish and the rubber and so on for the export market, the people who are selling them bicycles and so on are non-Malays. People who are money lenders are non-Malays, and many of the landlords are non-Malays. And so,
do you think that there will in fact be quite a lot of intermarriage in the future between people who are now Malays and Chinese?
Yeah, there is already considerable intermarriage, and I think it will increase as people come together. And the Malays have adopted very large numbers of Chinese babies for many years.
But basically, the object of Malaya as a nation is to create Malayans rather than Chinese or Malays.
That's right, yes, yes.
When the university was divided into two, University of Malaya and the National University of Singapore in 1959, we moved to Kuala Lumpur. But our move, however, was delayed by 1 year. And my father informed me that all his contemporaries from the other faculties were given professorial chairs of their respective departments. But for him, he was told that Professor Silcock, an expatriate at that time, wanted that appointment and had informed my father that he would later. Well, it was Dr. Chi Kun, the founder of the Gerakan Party and the leader of the opposition in Parliament, who was at that time on the University Council, who fought for my father's appointment. When our relocation in Kuala Lumpur happened, I got to know Dr. Tan as he became our family doctor and was always invited when faculty dinners were being held at our house. In 1958, however, prior to moving to Kuala Lumpur, my father had transferred me from a convent school where I had been receiving my primary education to the Singapore Chinese Girls' School in Singapore. He told me that one day China would become an important country and that I should learn to speak Mandarin. Indeed, he was a man with great foresight, and this was in 1958. When we arrived in Kuala Lumpur, my education resumed at a convent school, but my learning of Mandarin continued with a private tutor that came to our house until I reached Form 3. At the time, I had become fluent, able to write a one-page daily diary in Mandarin, and was able to read the more abbreviated Chinese newspapers. So much has already been said about my father's lifetime contribution to education. He had, as mentioned, given 40 years of his life to the University of Malaya, 20 years, which was as the Vice Chancellor. He was the first Malaysian to be appointed to lead the university. In the 3 decades that followed, the graduates included prime ministers, public and business figures of national prominence that contributed significantly to the several decades of Malaysia's golden years. He left a great legacy with the University of Malaya. It now still continues to be the highest ranked learning institution in Malaysia. In the latest QS World University Rankings, it ranked 9th in Asia, 3rd in Southeast Asia, and 59th in the world. Days before my father's passing, I informed him that the University of Malaya had made it to the top 10 universities in Asia. He was already in hospital at the time, but he was visibly pleased with the news. 3 aspects that have already been mentioned that involved his great foresight was, and I would like to mention it here, it may not exist anymore, but at that time, Pusat Asasi Science, the program that brought students from rural areas that where rural schools did not have the facilities of laboratories and so on, to provide the foundations to pursue the physical sciences. Many doctors, dentists, and engineers who have graduated from the University of Malaya have told me that they would not have ever been able to acquire the education from the University of Malaya had they not gained the foundations from the program offered by this. The second foresight he had was to look east to Japan and China well before anyone else did. He later received a prestigious award from the Japanese government in recognition of his role for establishing the relations in education between Malaysia and Japan. He was impressed with the discipline of the Japanese, and with his insights, he had seen the potential of China and therefore his looking east. A third aspect of his role in education that is not been mentioned and perhaps less known is the emphasis that he placed on the development of the brain and in the thinking potential of an individual. He himself was a great thinker of great intellect. In his early years, he became a great friend of Edward de Bono, known for the development of lateral thinking. Edward de Bono used to invite him to his castle in Malta, where he invited great thinkers. My father was also great friends with Tony Buzan, who maintained that the potential of the mind could be maximized if it was used according to how the brain was developed. At the university, and this has been mentioned, my father taught logic and thinking, in particular to the science students. In his own research on poverty and rural development, he focused a great deal on nutrition and how the deprivation of nutrition due to poverty resulted in poor physical and cognitive development, and how it reduced the health resilience of a child. He had recommended several times to the government for the introduction of a daily meal to be provided to the school children, but because of budget constraints, it was never implemented nationwide. More recently, it was partially implemented, but only for the B40 group. In his work on the brain and the mind, my father also developed and coined the Malay word for mind. It was Minda. He's written extensively on Minda Melayu. He believed on the importance of developing the mind and to strive to develop our intellectual capability. In many of his talks to young students, he would tell them to strive to be OBIs, orang berilmu, jika nak cemerlang. Let me share you this next video clip.
Ialah siswa-siswi kalau nak jadi cemerlang mesti boleh mengurus 5 perkara. You have to manage 5 things. 5 saja, tak banyak. But I will give you the details. 1, kesihatan. 2, masa. 3, ketenteraman, stres. 4, senam. Dan 5, kaedah belajar. So that's what it's all about. Hari ini saya bagi saudara-saudari idea OBI, orang berilmu. That's new. Today for you. My hadiah to you. So begitulah. Sebagai mengakhiri ceramah yang padat ni, saya akan beri peluang siapa nak tanya saya boleh tanya. Dan saya harap saudara-saudari dalam ceramah dapat menjamah fikiran saya. What I'm saying is just get a taste of what I'm talking about. In the film is the taste of honey. That's it. So inilah hadiah saya pada pagi ini. Dan saya berdoa saudara-saudari akan capai hasil cemerlangan. OBI abadi. Sekian. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
As already mentioned, is my father's role in supporting the arts. We always had artists, poets, and writers in our house. I grew up being educated on the great artworks of the world. I had the privilege of visiting many of the galleries in Philadelphia and London together with my father, and crowds would gather around us to listen to his explanations on the paintings. If he knew I was traveling to a particular city, He would compile information on the art galleries and the art exhibitions that I should see. I would bring back books, reproductions, and pamphlets, which he was always happy to receive. On the home front, the first local artist that I met was Syed Ahmad Jamal. It was in 1960. My father, then just a lecturer, had bought one of his paintings that was paid in installments. And my father told me he paid 380 ringgit for 10 months for it. The painting now is considered one of Syed Ahmad Jamal's best works. The next artist that I met was Chua Tien Teng, whose exhibition my father had opened in February of 1965. And this was the first time when the National Art Gallery had honored a local artist to do a one-man show. My father was then the chairman of the Board of Trustees of the National Art Gallery. In his opening remarks, my father stated that local artists should be given every attention and encouragement to develop their talents. My father also wrote the introduction to Teng's book about his art, in which he said he found his works highly appealing because of the reality he depicts of the rural environment, given that that was his main interest on poverty and rural development. He also expressed his great admiration for the talent that Teng had as an artist. In the intervening period, he engaged with many other artists and who subsequently became well known. It was after his appointment as Vice Chancellor that he had a chance meeting with Ibrahim Hussein in London. He saw his amazing talent and told him that he had to return to Malaysia. Upon learning that he had no income and no place to stay, my father set out to explore, to appoint him as a resident artist with accommodation at one of the fellows, as one of the fellows in the 5th College at the University of Malaya. He was assigned to paint, to give sessions on art to the students, and he stayed there until he was given a Rockefeller Foundation invitation to paint in New York for 1 year. He went on, as we know, to become one of Malaysia's internationally best-known artists. My father's departure from the university was an abrupt one, and I believe it was heartbreaking for him. He felt that he had a lot more to contribute to everyone else. He was highly disciplined and did not show any emotion when he announced his departure in the Great Hall of the University of Malaya, where my mother and I were present. Everyone thought the gathering was to celebrate his birthday, which was on the 28th of January. When he announced it, the entire hall was in shock and dismay. He was only 66. While his successor was yet to be appointed, and it was told that it would take some time, my father decided not to stay a day longer than when his contract had ended. His able deputy acted for the next 6 months. After leaving the university, my father continued to focus his attention on the development of the cooperative movement in Malaysia, while having an active role in the regional and international cooperative bodies. He had initiated the establishment, as has been mentioned, of ANGKASA and served as its president from its inception in 1971 until 2008. Funds earned by ANGKASA were redeployed back for cooperative education in Malaysia. In 2007, he received the Rochdale Pioneers Award in recognition of his contribution to initiating innovative and financially sustainable cooperative activities that have significantly benefited its membership. This award was introduced in the year 2000, and he is the first and only Malaysian to have received this award. One of his major accomplishments in his early years at the University of Malaya was his role, and this has not been mentioned, in resolving the railway dispute that had resulted in a railway strike that had paralyzed the economy. The railway at that time was the most important logistics network in the economy. The 32-day strike had started in 24th of December 1962 and brought the economy to a grounding halt. My father, who was then head of economics department at the University of Malaya, was called to be the mediator. The mediation process took place at the University of Malaya. At times, the meeting also took place at our house. Reporters camped outside, waiting for breaking news. When everything looked hopeless, there was an intervention by Prime Minister Ungku Abdul Aziz with new offers. He then requested for my father to resume the mediation. On the 14th of January, my father called Tan Siew Sin, the then Minister of Finance, to inform him that his offers made the previous day had been accepted. On 16th January, the trains started to run again. And on 22nd January, a 6-page agreement was signed to end the strike. Prime Minister Ungku Abdul Rahman publicly praised my father for his role in resolving this dispute and for working tirelessly and unselfishly without taking time off for sleep or food to end this dispute. To everyone, my beloved father is now no longer with us. On the 15th of December, 2020, my father passed away at the age of 98. He's very much missed. I have been blessed to have been his daughter, and he has prepared me well for my life, inspiring me to pursue and develop my intellect, something he said that no one can ever take away from you, and to be well grounded by discipline, principles, and values. He also inspired me to give a lifetime of service to the nation, knowing that it comes with many sacrifices and that it requires honor, bravery, and courage. It also requires a capacity for the highest level of endurance. While in Japan, he was drawn to learn about the samurai philosophy, and much of it was applied in his life. He would then always tell me that in the face of adversity, to always remember that I was a daughter of a samurai. While my family is still overwhelmed by sadness with his passing, and we miss him immensely, we have the very special memories that he left with us that continues to live on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tan Sri, for sharing your thought and remembrance with us today. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as the saying goes, to every beginning there is an ending, and now the event has come to its end. I'd like to invite Dr. Rohana Jani, our Senior Research Fellow at the Ungku Aziz Center for Development Study, to represent us for a closing remark. Please welcome Dr. Rohana.
Thank you, Dr. Diana. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and salam sejahtera. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is truly a privilege for me to be given the opportunity to say a few words on behalf of the Ungku Aziz Center for Development Studies at this prestigious event. This tribute marked the beginning of more discussions, dialogues, and debate on poverty, inequality, and related issues by organizing the forthcoming Ungku Aziz Intellectual Discourse 2021 that will be undertaken by the UAC through several platforms, namely the Ungku Aziz Public Lecture to discuss core issues such as inequalities and persistent rural poverty. Number two, the stakeholder roundtables. The roundtable will be organized to debate why the issues that were researched by Ungku Aziz in 1960s remain serious problems such as rural poverty and the inability to develop Malay entrepreneurship. Third will be the Ungku Aziz Brown Bag Seminar Series. The seminars will be by invitations, specifically with a focus on flagship research projects, including in the field of poverty and development studies, by academics in FEA and UAC research grants recipients. UAC currently has 3 ongoing flagship projects on poverty, that is, urban poverty in Lembah Pantai, Kuala Lumpur, poverty in Sabah, poverty in Sarawak. And to conclude with a conference to be held at the end of the year, 2021, inshallah, with keynotes by prominent academics and speakers who have dealt with issues similar to the ones Pak Ungku's research. We will review the papers published by Pak Ungku and will look into putting them together as a reader on his research. We will look to getting UIM Press to publish this, if possible, at the conference to be held in memory of his scholarly work. Hence, there is indeed plenty to reflect upon Pak Ungku's work that has made a tremendous difference in many of Malaysian lives, with his concern for the nation's poor, generating many noble initiatives designed to address and to alleviate poverty. With that, I end with the Malay proverb, harimau mati meninggalkan belang, manusia mati meninggalkan nama. I wish everyone a pleasant evening and stay safe. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Dr. Rohana Jani. Once again, on behalf of the Faculty of Economics and Administration and the Ungku Aziz Center for Development Studies, Universiti Malaya, I would like to express our gratitude for your participation to be with us today to commemorate Pak Ungku's great contributions. Although he's not with us today, his legacy continues and always be remembered. Before we end today's event, may I request for a group photo session. For those in Zoom, please turn on your video so that we can capture your photo. Thank you. Can I kindly ask Zoom audience, can you turn on your video so that we can capture your photo? Thank you. We will capture your photo now. 1, 2, 3. And another one, please. Can you turn on your video? 1, 2, and 3. Thank you, everyone. Let us end our program today by reciting Tasbih Kafarah and Suratul Ars. Thank you and have a pleasant day ahead. Thank you, everyone.